Okay, thanks, Cody. So I'm just going to take a few minutes today and talk a little bit about a project that we have. We've been focused quite a bit on oat forages, looking at these across the state, with the High Plains Ag Lab being one of our sites. And let's see, there we go. And so I often show this just to talk about the benefits of some of these cover crops that can also play double duty and serve the role as a forage crop as well for either grazing or haying. And so there are a lot of potential benefits of some of these crops, but there are also some trade-offs. For example, quite a bit of research done at the High Plains Ag Lab, as well as in other places in the High Plains, have found that by putting some of these cool season annual forages into a rotation, it reduces that soil moisture availability at planting, typically leads to a reduction in wheat yield. But other research has also suggested that it can have a higher increase in net returns. And the main thing that drives this is the amount of production that those cool season annual forages can provide, because they base on that on some of the hay prices often in their analyses. And so research out of Kansas recently said that growing a forage crop in wet years and using fallow and dry years, what they termed the flex fallow, would provide the highest returns in a system that they looked at down in Kansas. Now, if we had a crystal ball and could always tell, that would be the best way. And so, but we can't always. But we wanted to really kind of look at some of these cool season annual forages more to see what we could do to bump that production up or that quality in a way that you can be getting the most bang for your buck out of those. And so we did a little bit of work in the past looking at mixtures of oats and spring peas. And this was a study that was conducted in North Platte as well as the High Plains Ag Lab, where we just adjusted this mixture to see if there was an optimal mix. And what we found is that in drier climate at HPAL, that the oat monoculture actually produced a little bit more than any of the mixtures. And what we think it might have been is that those oats just really didn't do quite as well in those mixtures that we had. But if we looked at North Platte, where they had fairly average precipitation, they saw those mixtures present themselves and actually have a slightly higher when you substituted about 25 pounds of P or 17 pounds of P, 25 or so percent of the mix was P compared to the oats. And so, so we wanted to continue to look at this. And one of the questions we had was, what are some optimal seeding and end rate applications for these spring planted oats for a forage? And we hadn't looked at this in quite some time, and there's some newer varieties, so we wanted to look at some of these variables. And these are just some pictures of some of the plots at North Platte here. And so we decided to look at oats just mainly because of their ease of establishment. They grow rapidly, they can be productive and economical, and typically they're fairly high quality. The optimum window varies a little bit from the eastern side of the state to the west, but current recommendation rates that we've seen typically somewhere between that 80 to 100 pounds of seed. I've heard a little bit higher than that, and I've heard a little bit lower than that as well. And so we kind of wanted to fine tune that a little bit with some of these forage oats under different environments. And so we have 3 locations for this study, and both at North Platte, Lincoln, and then here at Sydney, where we took a seeding rate. Basically, we just went 25 to 100 pounds of seed. The star represents somewhere where that average or recommended rate is, and then we just mixed that with our N application of 0 to 60 pounds of N per acre. We chose a Goliath variety, which is it's a taller variety oat, can be used as both seed and forage. We planted it late March, early April, and then we harvested in mid-June. We were really focused trying to get that soft dough stage. So the measurements that we took on this were forage production, forage quality, and then number of tillers. And so this is just 1 year that we've done this. We'll do it again this following year. But this picture here on the left shows our plot layout here. And this was right around the time that we harvested. So as you can see, we didn't get a whole lot of growth in 2020. And so basically, I'm going to show these in 2 different figures. The one is the seeding rate and the other one's just the fertilization. So we didn't see much for interactions between fertilization and seeding rate. So it's best to look at them in each of their categories separate. And so when we look at the seeding rate, we see that at the High Plains Ag Lab, it was about 2,000 pounds per acre is what we had. And so this was less than what we typically get there. In the past studies, the oats that we've planted at somewhere around that 75 pounds per acre. Typically, we were getting about 3,000 pounds per acre, a little bit more than that in some of the wet years. But precipitation in from March to June was only about 46% of what we typically get there. So we were fairly dry, as I'm sure you all well know, last year. But when we look at the other sites, typically we saw a little bit of variability, but when we averaged it across all sites, what we saw was that between about 50 pounds and 100 pounds per acre of seed, we really didn't see that much difference in our forage production averaged across all the sites. We only really saw it start to affect production when it was between that 25 and 50 pounds of seed that we saw that biomass production drop off. When we look at fertilization, we typically saw generally a similar pattern that we would have expected when it goes from no nitrogen all the way up to 60 pounds of nitrogen. We're not quite sure what was happening at HPAL here, that it didn't see that response from 30 to 60 pounds. And so another year of data, hopefully we'll have maybe some better answers for that. And so when we look at forage quality, I'm only going to talk about crude protein here, but typically we saw a fairly similar pattern across the sites, a slightly higher crude protein at high HPAL. Partially for that, it was due to the low amount of growth that we saw, so a higher concentration of crude protein. But across all the sites, we typically saw that at 25 pounds per acre of seed had a higher crude protein content compared to the heavier seeding rates. For fertilization, we kind of saw we typically saw at all the sites a fairly similar pattern, but as fertilization increased, that crude protein content increased along with it. And then lastly, as we expected to see that as the seeding rate increased, we did see a greater number of tillers. So the lowest number of tillers were the 25 pounds, the highest was at the 100 pounds. And we really didn't see an influence of fertilization on the number of tillers that were out there per foot. So just some take homes that we got from the first year of data collection. Typically, we didn't see much of a difference when averaged across all sites between the 50 to 100 pounds per acre. There was a little bit of variability amongst the sites, but overall, we saw that there was similar biomass as well as fairly similar crude protein content at those seeding rates. But when we did go to the 25 pounds per acre, we saw about 11% less biomass and about 16% greater crude protein at that lower seeding rate. And then tiller numbers per foot increased as seeding rate increased. And so for fertilization, we saw an increase from 0 to 30 to 60 pounds of N per acre for biomass and crude protein. However, we saw a greater jump from that 0 to 30 than we did that 30 to 60, and we'll look more into that into the future. But our pounds of N per acre did not influence the tiller numbers. And so that's just a quick update of a project we have going on there now. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, any questions for Mitch while we transition? Deepak, if you want to get your slides pulled up, you can, and we'll let any questions for Mitch.